The year is 1880, and the world is beginning to shift. Across the ocean in Europe, empires are asserting their power, while in America, industrialization is sweeping the land, bringing both progress and hardship. It is during this transformative period that Frances Perkins is born in Boston, Massachusetts. The country is on the brink of the 20th century, a time of immense change that will shape her destiny. Frances was raised in a world where the Industrial Revolution had already begun to take hold, where the divide between the rich and the poor was ever widening. The streets of New York, filled with the sounds of workers and factories, would later become her stage for reform. She would go on to become a pioneering figure in American politics, advocating for the rights of the workers, the marginalized and the forgotten. In 1933, Frances Perkins made history by becoming the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States. Appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as Secretary of Labor, this journey through her life is one of dedication, resilience, and unwavering commitment to social justice. From the days of her youth, through the struggles and triumphs of her career, Frances Perkins reshaped the labor laws of the United States and laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. As you listen, let the quiet flow of her story guide you through the events of the past. And as you drift into rest, remember her impact, felt even today, in the lives of millions of workers, children, and families. Before we begin, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and share where you're listening from, as you settle in for a peaceful journey through the life of Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins' early life was shaped by a combination of privilege and hardship, a balance that would influence her later decisions and perspectives. Born on April 10th, 1880, in Boston, she came into the world at the cusp of monumental changes. Her family was upper middle class, and her father, who worked as a successful banker, provided a stable home. But it was not just her father's financial position that shaped Frances. It was the atmosphere of curiosity, intellect, and purpose that surrounded her growing up. As a child, Frances had a sharp mind and an inquisitive nature, traits that were nurtured in the intellectual environment her family fostered. Her mother, a devoted Christian and active in social causes, had a significant influence on her worldview. Frances would later recall the moral lessons her mother imparted, particularly the importance of helping those in need and understanding the struggles of others. This moral grounding, coupled with her exposure to social activism, would stay with her throughout her life, even as she embarked on her career. By the time Frances reached her teenage years, she began to show a deep interest in intellectual pursuits. She was drawn to reading, exploring works on philosophy, politics, and history. But perhaps more important than her intellectual abilities was the environment in which they were cultivated. Growing up during the Industrial Revolution in the United States, Frances witnessed firsthand the societal divides that industrialization had exacerbated. She could see the contrast between the lives of the wealthy and the struggles of the working class, and this disparity left a lasting impression on her. At the age of 17, Frances enrolled at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. This institution, known for its strong academic reputation, would be a critical stepping stone in her intellectual development. It was here that Frances would begin to shape her ideas about the world, and, more importantly, her place in it. Mount Holyoke was an all-female college, and it provided an environment where women could pursue their academic interests without the constraints imposed by society at large. Frances excelled in her studies, quickly establishing herself as one of the brightest students in her class. During her time at Mount Holyoke, Frances was introduced to a wide range of ideas that would influence her future career. The college's curriculum included courses on social theory, economics, and political science, subjects that would become the foundation for her advocacy later in life. But perhaps most importantly, it was at Mount Holyoke that Frances encountered the teachings of social reformers like Jane Addams and her work with Hull House in Chicago, a settlement house designed to support the poor and immigrant communities. These figures became a source of inspiration for Frances, reinforcing her growing belief that society had a moral responsibility to address the plight of the working class and vulnerable populations. By the time she graduated in 1902, Frances was deeply committed to social change. She had honed her intellectual abilities, but her heart had been equally shaped by a desire to act on the knowledge she had gained. Rather than continuing with the traditional career path in education or another academic field, she turned her attention to social work, eager to make a direct impact on the lives of those in need. Her next step took her to New York City, where she would immerse herself in the realities of urban poverty. In the years following her graduation, Frances worked with a variety of charitable organizations, including the Consumers League, which advocated for better working conditions and fair wages. She began to see the stark contrast between the affluent classes she had encountered in her youth and the severe struggles of the city's working poor. Her time in New York was transformative. Frances became acutely aware of the systemic problems that perpetuated poverty, particularly the labour conditions in factories and the plight of immigrant workers. Her observations were eye-opening. The long hours, poor working conditions and exploitation faced by many labourers were stark reminders of the failure of industrialisation to consider the humanity of the worker. Frances' experiences in the city were not limited to her professional work. She also saw firsthand the hardships that working women faced. In many ways, the factory workers she encountered were the backbone of the industrial economy, yet they were often treated as expendable and ignored by the public. It was through her interactions with these women, many of whom were immigrants, that Frances began to see her mission clearly. She would dedicate her life to improving the lives of workers, particularly women, who were too often overlooked. As Frances continued her work in New York, she came to the realization that social work alone was not enough. The root of the issues she was observing, labor exploitation, child labor, long hours and unsafe conditions, was tied to a lack of strong laws protecting workers. What was needed was not just charity but legislative change. She began to shift her focus from social work to law and policy, understanding that lasting change could only be achieved through comprehensive reforms. Frances's journey through the intellectual and social currents of her time was long and arduous, but each experience, each moment of witnessing inequality would shape her future. The influences that shaped her early years, from her family's values to the professors at Mount Holyoke to the workers she met in New York, prepared her for the challenges ahead. She was ready to step into the world of policy and political reform, armed with an understanding of the issues and a deep compassion for those affected by them. And so, with her sense of purpose firmly rooted, Frances Perkins' story would soon move beyond these early influences toward the greater struggles and triumphs of her life. Her time at Mount Holyoke, the lessons she learned, and the work she began in New York were only the beginning of a journey that would change the face of American labor laws forever. In the early 1900s, New York City was a thriving, pulsating metropolis, a center of commerce, culture, and unfortunately stark inequality. It was here, amid the cacophony of industry and the rapid expansion of the urban landscape, that Frances Perkins made one of the most important decisions of her young life. Having completed her studies at Mount Holyoke, she left the comfort of her childhood home in Boston and moved to New York City, ready to immerse herself in the world of social reform. New York, with its labyrinth of tenement buildings and crowded streets, was a city teeming with energy. Yet beneath the surface of this bustling city lay the grim realities of industrialization. The gap between the rich and the poor had never been so wide, and Frances soon found herself face to face with the raw injustice of the working class. Her first experience of the city was both eye-opening and deeply unsettling. Frances quickly became involved in social work, dedicating herself to helping the city's poor and immigrant communities. She worked with various charitable organizations, the most significant being the Consumers League. This group, which advocated for better working conditions, fair wages and hours, gave Frances the opportunity to directly address some of the worst abuses she had observed. Through her work with the League, she gained a deeper understanding of the systemic inequalities faced by the working poor, especially women. One of the greatest shocks Frances encountered was the abysmal working conditions that many factory workers endured. The sweatshops and factories, filled with men, women and children, were some of the most dangerous places in the city. Workers laboured for long hours in unsafe conditions, earning meagre wages if they were paid at all. Frances spent countless hours visiting these factories, listening to the stories of the workers, and witnessing firsthand the gruelling toll these conditions took on their lives. It was during this period that Frances began to recognise the need for a more structured, systemic solution to the problems she had been witnessing. While her work in social reform and charity had an immediate impact, she understood that lasting change would only come from legislative action. The injustices she saw could not be solved with charity alone. They required legal protections for workers and, most importantly, comprehensive labour laws. As Frances grew more involved in the labour movement, she found herself drawn to the broader issue of industrial reform. She became increasingly disillusioned with the charity-based approach to social welfare and began to shift her focus to the need for political change. It became clear to her that the problems faced by workers were not merely personal struggles. They were the result of a system that allowed exploitation to flourish. The industrialists who profited from the labour of the poor were rarely held accountable for the conditions in which their workers toiled. Frances believed that the government needed to step in, not just to regulate industries, but to ensure that the rights of workers were protected. In the midst of her work, Frances met several influential figures who would become key allies in her fight for labour reform. One of the most significant of these was Al Smith, a prominent New York politician who would later serve as the governor of New York. Smith, a strong proponent of labour rights, recognised Frances's potential and began to mentor her. Under his guidance, Frances became involved in the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, a body created to examine labour conditions in the state's factories. This experience would prove to be transformative, shaping her understanding of how legislation could improve the lives of workers. The work of the commission was gruelling, but immensely important. Frances and her colleagues visited factories, spoke to workers, and compiled reports detailing the horrific conditions in which labourers were forced to work. These reports painted a grim picture of industrial life in New York, revealing widespread abuses such as child labour, unsafe working conditions, and long hours. The Commission's findings led to the passage of several important pieces of legislation, including laws that regulated working hours, prohibited child labour, and required employers to provide safer working conditions. Despite these victories, Frances knew that there was still much work to be done. Her time in New York was not only formative in terms of her professional development, but also in terms of her personal growth. The city was both a crucible and a catalyst for her ideals. In the face of so much injustice, Frances was solidifying her belief that social change would not come easily. It would require determination, unwavering resolve, and above all, a deep commitment to justice. By now, Frances had fully embraced the idea that meaningful change would require more than just grassroots efforts. It would require political action at the highest levels of government. This realization was pivotal in shaping her future career path. She understood that the New York State Factory Investigating Commission had given her valuable experience, but if she truly wanted to effect nationwide change, she would need to take her fight to Washington. New York had been a place of awakening for Frances Perkins, a place where she witnessed the suffering of workers firsthand and began to understand the scope of the problems they faced. But as much as New York had shaped her, it was clear that she would need to move beyond the confines of the city to make the broader, lasting changes she envisioned. Little did she know that her time in New York was only the beginning of a long and transformative journey, a journey that would lead her to the highest halls of American power, where she would become a tireless advocate for the rights of the working class and the first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet position. Frances Perkins' experience in New York forged her into a passionate advocate for workers' rights and laid the groundwork for the reform work she would undertake in the years to come. As she prepared to step onto the national stage, her heart and mind were focused on one goal: to bring about a system of labour laws that would protect workers and ensure a fairer, more just society for all. The year was 1911, and New York City was a place of both great opportunity and overwhelming tragedy. It was in this city, amid the bustling streets and industrial might, that one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history occurred: the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This catastrophe, which claimed the lives of 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, became a pivotal moment in Frances Perkins' life, one that would propel her into the forefront of labour reform. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located on the upper floors of a building in Manhattan, and it was notorious for its poor working conditions. The factory employed hundreds of young women, many of whom were immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe. They worked long hours in cramped, unsanitary conditions, producing shirtwaists, blouses that were a popular fashion item at the time. Despite the dangerous environment, workers had little choice but to endure the grueling conditions, as they had no other means of support. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the top floor of the factory. The flames quickly spread, trapping the workers inside. The factory's owners had locked the doors to the stairwells and exits, a common practice in those days to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. As the fire spread, workers desperately tried to escape, but the locked doors, combined with the lack of proper fire escapes, made it impossible for many to flee. Some workers jumped from the windows to escape the flames, falling to their deaths on the pavement below. Others perished inside as the fire consumed the building. When the fire was finally brought under control, the devastation was overwhelming. The loss of life was not just a tragedy. It was a stark reminder of the callous disregard for the safety of workers, particularly women in the workplace. For Frances Perkins, the fire was not just another tragedy. It was a wake-up call. She was deeply shaken by the event, but it also fueled her determination to fight for labour reforms that could prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. At the time of the fire, Frances had already been working in New York for several years, advocating for the rights of workers and addressing the inequalities that were rampant in the industrial world. However, the fire made her realise just how urgent the need for reform was. It crystallised her belief that the government needed to step in to protect workers and ensure that businesses were held accountable for their actions. In the wake of the fire, Frances became more determined than ever to fight for legislative changes. She understood that the tragedy was not just a result of one company's negligence, but was indicative of the broader systemic issues that existed in American labour practices. The fire exposed the horrifying realities of industrial working conditions, realities that Frances had already seen but now seemed even more urgent in their need for action. Following the fire, Frances joined the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, a body that had been formed to examine and address the safety of factory workers. The commission's work, which had already been underway before the fire, took on new urgency after the tragedy. Frances was instrumental in pushing for stronger regulations on factory safety, advocating for laws that would ensure workers had proper fire escapes, unlocked doors, and sufficient training in fire safety. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had a profound impact on Frances Perkins, both personally and professionally. It solidified her resolve to fight for better working conditions and greater protections for labourers. More importantly, it showed her that real change would not come from individual acts of charity, but from the collective action of workers, social reformers, and lawmakers. The fire was a clear example of how dangerous it was to allow businesses to regulate themselves, and Frances understood that government intervention was the only way to ensure that workers' rights would be safeguarded. The tragedy also reinforced Frances' belief in the need for a comprehensive approach to labour reform. She had seen firsthand the suffering of workers, and the fire highlighted the urgent need for systemic changes. As a result, she became more involved in pushing for national labour legislation, including laws that would regulate working hours, set safety standards, and ensure workers had the right to organise. The fire was not just a wake-up call. It was a defining moment in Frances Perkins' life, one that shaped the course of her career and helped her solidify her commitment to labour reform. Over time, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire would become one of the most important milestones in the history of labour reform in the United States. It galvanised the labour movement and led to the passage of several important pieces of legislation aimed at improving working conditions. The fire also cemented Frances Perkins' place as one of the most influential figures in the fight for labour rights in the 20th century. As Frances looked back on the fire later in her life, she saw it not just as a personal tragedy, but as a turning point in her career. It was the moment when she fully understood the magnitude of the work that lay ahead of her and the importance of government intervention in the workplace. The fire had shaken her, but it also fueled her determination to make a difference. And as history would show, Frances Perkins was not one to back down in the face of adversity. In the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, Frances Perkins found herself at the centre of a movement that would forever alter the landscape of American labour laws. Her experiences in the aftermath of the tragedy propelled her into a key role in the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, a body created to examine and reform the unsafe working conditions in New York's factories. It was here that Perkins would further solidify her position as a tireless advocate for workers' rights and a reformer with an unwavering commitment to change. The Factory Investigating Commission was formed in 1911, just months after the fire, and its purpose was to investigate the conditions in which factory workers laboured and to propose reforms that would improve their safety. Frances Perkins was appointed to the commission, and it became a defining chapter in her career. The commission's work was far-reaching and meticulous, gathering testimonies from workers, conducting on-site inspections of factories, and compiling evidence of the often horrific conditions that workers endured. As a member of the commission, Frances played a key role in gathering evidence and advocating for change. She visited factories across New York, witnessing firsthand the dangerous conditions that workers faced. In one factory after another, she saw workers labouring long hours in poorly ventilated, unsanitary environments with little regard for their safety. These visits were deeply upsetting, but they also fueled her resolve to push for laws that would guarantee safer working conditions for everyone, particularly women and children who were disproportionately affected by industrial exploitation. During these factory visits, Frances met countless workers, many of them women and young girls, who had suffered physical injuries, respiratory problems, and emotional trauma from working in hazardous conditions. She listened to their stories with compassion and determination, understanding that their suffering was not a mere accident, but the result of a system that allowed business owners to prioritize profits over people. These encounters reinforced her belief that reform could no longer be delayed. It had to happen now. Frances was particularly moved by the plight of child workers. Many of the factories she visited employed children as young as 7 or 8 years old. These children worked in dangerous environments, often performing repetitive tasks for long hours, with little regard for their physical or emotional well-being. Frances, deeply moved by their plight, made child labour reform a central part of her advocacy. She saw child labour not just as an injustice, but as a barrier to the future of American society, an obstacle to the possibility of a healthier, more just world for all children. In her role with the Factory Investigating Commission, Frances worked tirelessly to advocate for sweeping reforms. She pushed for the creation of new regulations that would limit working hours, improve factory ventilation, mandate fire safety measures, and raise the minimum age for child workers. She also advocated for the establishment of worker compensation laws that would provide financial support to those who were injured on the job. One of the most significant achievements of the Commission's work was the creation of the first factory safety codes in New York State. These codes required businesses to install proper fire escapes, ensure that doors were unlocked during working hours, and provide adequate lighting and ventilation. These safety regulations, although modest by today's standards, were groundbreaking at the time and laid the foundation for future labour laws. Frances was instrumental in ensuring that the findings of the Commission were not merely recommendations but concrete proposals for new legislation. She worked closely with New York's political leaders, particularly Governor Al Smith, who became a key ally in her efforts. Through their collaborative work, the Commission succeeded in pushing through several key pieces of labour reform legislation, including laws that required factories to provide safe working conditions, regulate working hours, and protect children from exploitation. The work of the Factory Investigating Commission was not without its challenges. Business leaders and conservative politicians resisted the proposed reforms, arguing that they would harm the economy and disrupt the free market. However, Frances remained steadfast in her belief that the welfare of workers should come before profits. She understood that the rights of workers could no longer be sacrificed for the sake of economic efficiency. Despite the opposition, Frances's efforts were largely successful. The reforms passed by the Commission were a major victory for the labour movement and marked a turning point in the fight for workers' rights in America. The laws that resulted from the Commission's work laid the groundwork for many of the labour protections that would come to define the 20th century, including the right to form labour unions, the regulation of child labour, and the establishment of workplace safety standards. For Frances, the work with the Commission was not just a career milestone, it was a personal mission. It confirmed her belief that the government had a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The Factory Investigating Commission allowed her to put her ideas into practice, to take the theoretical concepts she had developed as a social worker and transform them into concrete legislation that would improve the lives of millions of people. As she continued her work, Frances Perkins' reputation as a dedicated and compassionate advocate for workers grew. She became a trusted voice in the fight for labour reform, and her influence extended far beyond the borders of New York State. Her experiences with the Factory Investigating Commission helped shape her vision for national labour reform, and it was clear that she was destined to play a larger role in the future of American labour policy. The work Frances did during her time with the Factory Investigating Commission was just the beginning of her lifelong commitment to labour reform. It was a formative period in her life that solidified her belief that social change could only come through comprehensive legislation, and it gave her the tools and experience she would need to become one of the most influential figures in the history of American labour. By the time Frances Perkins had completed her work with the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, she had already proven herself to be a committed advocate for workers' rights. But it was also during this period that she began to find her voice as a reformer, a voice that would resonate far beyond the factory walls of New York. The years following the Commission's work would see Frances emerge as one of the most respected and effective advocates for labour reform in the United States. Her involvement in social reform wasn't just about passing laws. It was about changing the way society viewed the relationship between the individual and the state. Frances believed that the government had an obligation to ensure the welfare of its citizens, particularly the most vulnerable, those who worked long hours in dangerous conditions for little pay. This belief became the cornerstone of her work as she began to think more broadly about the role of the federal government in shaping labour policies. Frances was a firm believer in the power of public policy to create lasting change. As a social worker, she had seen firsthand the limitations of charity and volunteerism in addressing systemic issues like poverty and unsafe working conditions. While charitable efforts were valuable, Frances understood that the real solution lay in laws and policies that could reach every corner of the country and address issues on a national scale. To her, the work she'd done with the Factory Investigating Commission was just the beginning. If she wanted to make a real difference in the lives of American workers, she needed to push for reforms at the national level. One of Frances' key strategies was to build alliances with like-minded individuals who could help amplify her voice and give her the political leverage she needed to push for reform. Among her most important allies was Al Smith, the governor of New York, who had been an early supporter of her work on the Factory Investigating Commission. Smith, a strong advocate for labour rights, recognised Frances' potential and began to mentor her, guiding her as she navigated the complexities of political reform. Under Smith's guidance, Frances began to take on a more prominent role in the political sphere. She became involved in various progressive organisations, including the National Consumers League, where she worked alongside other reformers to advocate for better working conditions, minimum wages, and child labour laws. Frances' voice in these organisations was strong and unwavering, and she became known for her calm yet forceful advocacy for the rights of workers. Her ability to speak out on behalf of the most marginalised members of society, especially women and children, earned her the respect of many in the political and social reform communities. But Frances was not content to simply advocate for change from the outside. She understood that true reform could only come from within the halls of government. As she became more involved in social reform, she began to consider how she could influence policy at the federal level. She knew that to achieve her goals, she would need to work within the system, using her knowledge and expertise to shape the policies that would define the future of American labour. In the mid-1920s, Frances' opportunity came when she met Franklin D. Roosevelt, then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt, like Frances, was deeply committed to progressive reform, and the two quickly formed a strong professional relationship. They shared many of the same views on the need for government intervention in the economy and the protection of workers' rights. Roosevelt recognized Frances's expertise in labor issues and began to consult with her on various policy matters. As their relationship grew, so did Frances's influence in the political world. By 1933, when Roosevelt became President of the United States, Frances Perkins was ready to step into a larger role. She'd spent years advocating for labour reforms at the state and national levels, and her work had garnered her a reputation as one of the foremost experts on labour policy in the country. Roosevelt, recognising her dedication and expertise, made a historic decision. He appointed Frances Perkins as the first woman to serve in a US cabinet position, naming her Secretary of Labour. At the time of her appointment, many in the political establishment were shocked by the decision. Frances' appointment was groundbreaking, not just because she was a woman, but because she was someone who had spent her career challenging the status quo and pushing for reforms that many considered too radical. But Roosevelt saw in Frances the qualities that would make her an effective advocate for labour rights: a deep understanding of the issues, a steadfast commitment to change, and a calm, methodical approach to policy. Frances's appointment to the cabinet was a pivotal moment in her career. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see her take on some of the most important challenges facing American workers. But it was also a personal triumph for Frances, a culmination of years of hard work, perseverance, and belief in the power of government to effect positive change. As she took office as Secretary of Labour, she was prepared to face the challenges ahead and continue her lifelong fight for the rights of workers. In 1929, as the Great Depression took hold of the United States, the country was facing an economic crisis unlike any in its history. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, and millions of Americans were living in poverty. It was in this bleak period that Frances Perkins met Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who would become a transformative figure in her life and career. At the time, Roosevelt was serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but it was clear to those around him that he had larger ambitions. His reputation as a reformer was growing, and he had a vision for a new kind of government, one that would take an active role in alleviating the suffering of the American people. Frances, too, was deeply concerned about the economic collapse and the suffering it caused, and it was through her work with various progressive organisations that she came into contact with Roosevelt. Their first meeting was more than just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a partnership that would change the course of American history. Frances' reputation as a committed social reformer and expert on labour issues had already earned her respect in political circles, and Roosevelt quickly recognised her expertise. He was drawn to her calm demeanour, her thorough understanding of social issues, and her steadfast belief in the power of government to intervene on behalf of the most vulnerable members of society. Frances, for her part, was impressed by Roosevelt's vision and leadership. She saw in him a kindred spirit, a man who understood the importance of government action in addressing the crises facing the nation. They shared similar views on the need for a government that would act as a force for social justice and economic fairness. Roosevelt believed, as Francis did, that the government had a responsibility to protect workers, provide economic security, and ensure that no one was left behind in times of crisis. As their professional relationship deepened, Roosevelt began to rely on Francis' counsel and insights. She became one of his closest advisors, and the two worked together to develop policies aimed at addressing the economic devastation of the Depression. Francis played a key role in shaping Roosevelt's vision for the New Deal, a series of ambitious programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform to the American people. Roosevelt's political acumen and Francis' expertise in labor issues were a powerful combination. They worked tirelessly to create programs that would provide jobs, protect workers' rights, and support the most vulnerable members of society. One of the most significant pieces of legislation to emerge from their partnership was the Social Security Act of 1935, which laid the foundation for the modern welfare state in the United States. The act established unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid for dependent children, marking a major victory in the fight for economic security for all Americans. Francis' work with Roosevelt was not limited to just one piece of legislation. It was a collaborative effort to reshape the American social safety net. As the first woman to serve as Secretary of Labor, Francis was in a unique position to push for policies that would protect workers and improve their conditions. She used her position to advocate for a fair minimum wage, safe working conditions, and better labor laws. Her leadership and dedication to social justice were instrumental in the passage of numerous pieces of labor legislation that improved the lives of millions of Americans. As she worked alongside Roosevelt, Francis became one of the most influential women in American politics. Despite the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated political world, she remained steadfast in her commitment to labor reform. Roosevelt's trust in her abilities gave her the platform she needed to push for significant changes in labor laws, and she became a powerful advocate for workers' rights on the national stage. Their partnership was not without its challenges, however. As with any political alliance, there were disagreements and tensions along the way. Francis, deeply committed to the principles of social justice, sometimes found herself at odds with more conservative members of Roosevelt's administration. Despite these differences, she remained loyal to Roosevelt and continued to work tirelessly to ensure that his vision for a more just society was realized. In many ways, Roosevelt and Perkins complemented each other. Roosevelt's charismatic leadership and ability to connect with the American people were matched by Francis' quiet but unyielding dedication to the cause of labor reform. Together, they formed a formidable team that would help guide the nation through the darkest days of the Depression and set the stage for the post-war era. As Francis worked alongside Roosevelt, she became increasingly aware of the power of government to effect change. She saw firsthand how Roosevelt's leadership could move mountains and change the course of history. Her experience with him reinforced her belief that a strong, active government was essential to addressing the needs of the American people and ensuring that the nation remained on a path toward justice and equality. For Francis, the relationship with Roosevelt was not just professional, it was personal as well. She respected him deeply, and their bond was one of mutual trust and admiration. He recognized her brilliance and dedication, and she in turn saw in him a leader who understood the importance of labor rights and social reform. Their partnership was based on a shared vision for a better America, one in which the government would take an active role in promoting the welfare of its citizens. As the New Deal progressed, Francis Perkins' role in shaping American labor laws and social policy grew even more significant. She became a key figure in the Roosevelt administration, trusted not only for her expertise in labor issues, but also for her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the time. Her work with Roosevelt would go down in history as one of the most successful collaborations in American political history, laying the foundation for the modern welfare state and changing the lives of countless workers and families across the country. In 1929, As the Great Depression took hold of the United States, the country was facing an economic crisis unlike any in its history. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, and millions of Americans were living in poverty. It was in this bleak period that Frances Perkins met Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who had become a transformative figure in her life and career. At the time, Roosevelt was serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but it was clear to those around him that he had larger ambitions. His reputation as a reformer was growing, and he had a vision for a new kind of government, one that would take an active role in alleviating the suffering of the American people. Frances, too, was deeply concerned about the economic collapse and the suffering it caused, and it was through her work with various progressive organizations that she came into contact with Roosevelt. Their first meeting was more than just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a partnership that would change the course of American history. Frances' reputation as a committed social reformer and expert on labor issues had already earned her respect in political circles, and Roosevelt quickly recognized her expertise. He was drawn to her calm demeanor, her thorough understanding of social issues, and her steadfast belief in the power of government to intervene on behalf of the most vulnerable members of society. Frances, for her part, was impressed by Roosevelt's vision and leadership. She saw in him a kindred spirit, a man who understood the importance of government action in addressing the crises facing the nation. They shared similar views on the need for a government that would act as a force for social justice and economic fairness. Roosevelt believed, as Frances did, that the government had a responsibility to protect workers, provide economic security, and ensure that no one was left behind in times of crisis. As their professional relationship deepened, Roosevelt began to rely on Frances's counsel and insights. She became one of his closest advisors, and the two worked together to develop policies aimed at addressing the economic devastation of the Depression. Frances played a key role in shaping Roosevelt's vision for the New Deal, a series of ambitious programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform to the American people. Roosevelt's political acumen and Frances' expertise in labor issues were a powerful combination. They worked tirelessly to create programs that would provide jobs, protect workers' rights, and support the most vulnerable members of society. One of the most significant pieces of legislation to emerge from their partnership was the Social Security Act of 1935, which laid the foundation for the modern welfare state in the United States. The act established unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid for dependent children, marking a major victory in the fight for economic security for all Americans. Frances' work with Roosevelt was not limited to just one piece of legislation. It was a collaborative effort to reshape the American social safety net. As the first woman to serve as Secretary of Labor, Frances was in a unique position to push for policies that would protect workers and improve their conditions. She used her position to advocate for a fair minimum wage, safe working conditions, and better labor laws. Her leadership and dedication to social justice were instrumental in the passage of numerous pieces of labor legislation that improved the lives of millions of Americans. As she worked alongside Roosevelt, Frances became one of the most influential women in American politics. Despite the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated political world, she remained steadfast in her commitment to labor reform. Roosevelt's trust in her abilities gave her the platform she needed to push for significant changes in labor laws, and she became a powerful advocate for workers' rights on the national stage. Their partnership was not without its challenges, however. As with any political alliance, there were disagreements and tensions along the way. Frances, deeply committed to the principles of social justice, sometimes found herself at odds with more conservative members of Roosevelt's administration. Despite these differences, she remained loyal to Roosevelt and continued to work tirelessly to ensure that his vision for a more just society was realized. In many ways, Roosevelt and Perkins complemented each other. Roosevelt's charismatic leadership and ability to connect with the American people were matched by Frances' quiet but unyielding dedication to the cause of labor reform. Together they formed a formidable team that would help guide the nation through the darkest days of the Depression and set the stage for the post-war era. As Frances worked alongside Roosevelt, she became increasingly aware of the power of government to effect change. She saw firsthand how Roosevelt's leadership could move mountains and change the course of history. Her experience with him reinforced her belief that a strong, active government was essential to addressing the needs of the American people and ensuring that the nation remained on a path toward justice and equality. For Frances, the relationship with Roosevelt was not just professional, it was personal as well. She respected him deeply, and their bond was one of mutual trust and admiration. He recognized her brilliance and dedication, and she, in turn, saw in him a leader who understood the importance of labor rights and social reform. Their partnership was based on a shared vision for a better America, one in which the government would take an active role in promoting the welfare of its citizens. As the New Deal progressed, Frances Perkins' role in shaping American labor laws and social policy grew even more significant. She became a key figure in the Roosevelt administration, trusted not only for her expertise in labor issues, but also for her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the time. Her work with Roosevelt would go down in history as one of the most successful collaborations in American political history, laying the foundation for the modern welfare state and changing the lives of countless workers and families across the country. In 1933, as the United States faced the unprecedented economic crisis of the Great Depression, a momentous event occurred in American politics. Franklin D. Roosevelt, newly inaugurated as president, selected Frances Perkins as his Secretary of Labor. She became the first woman in U.S. history to serve in a presidential cabinet, a remarkable achievement at a time when women were largely excluded from positions of political power. But this appointment was not just a historic milestone. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Frances Perkins' life, one that would see her rise to become one of the most influential figures in the fight for labor rights and social justice in the United States. Frances Perkins' appointment was both a personal triumph and a testament to her decades of hard work and dedication to the cause of labor reform. It was a moment she had been preparing for her entire life, but it also marked a turning point in her career. She was no longer an outside advocate calling for change. She was now inside the halls of power, tasked with helping shape the policies that would define the future of American labor. For Frances, this appointment was more than just a recognition of her expertise. It was an opportunity to put her vision of social justice into practice on a national scale. She had spent years working with various progressive organizations and advocating for labor reforms at the state and local levels, but now she had the power and influence to create real, lasting change for workers across the country. Her appointment as Secretary of Labor was a critical moment in her life, one that would see her bring about some of the most important labor reforms in American history. The role of Secretary of Labor was a challenging one, particularly during the Great Depression. Frances was tasked with addressing the widespread unemployment, poverty, and inequality that had left millions of Americans struggling to survive. Her work would be a delicate balancing act. She would need to navigate the demands of the labor movement, business interests, and politicians to create policies that could bring about meaningful change without further exacerbating the nation's economic problems. But Frances was undaunted. She approached the task with the same quiet determination and sense of purpose that had guided her throughout her career. As Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins worked tirelessly to improve working conditions and expand the rights of American workers. She was instrumental in creating a series of New Deal programs aimed at providing relief to the unemployed, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Public Works Administration, PWA. These programs put millions of Americans to work, building infrastructure and completing public works projects across the country. But Frances' most significant achievement as Secretary of Labor was her role in crafting the Social Security Act of 1935, one of the most important pieces of social welfare legislation in U.S. history. The Act established a system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and welfare for dependent children, and it laid the foundation for the modern welfare state in the United States. It was a groundbreaking piece of legislation that fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and its citizens, and Frances Perkins was at the heart of it. The passage of the Social Security Act was a triumph for Frances and for the labour movement. It was the culmination of years of advocacy and hard work, and it represented the realisation of Frances's vision of a society in which the government took an active role in ensuring the well-being of its citizens. The Act provided economic security for millions of Americans and established a system of social safety nets that would protect workers in times of need. In addition to the Social Security Act, Frances also played a key role in the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the 40-hour work week, set a federal minimum wage, and prohibited child labor in most industries. This legislation was another major victory for Frances and for the labor movement, as it helped to improve working conditions and ensure that workers received fair compensation for their labor. Frances was also an advocate for workers' rights to organize and form unions. She understood that the strength of the labor movement lay in its ability to unite workers and advocate for their collective interests. As Secretary of Labor, she worked to ensure that workers had the right to join unions and negotiate for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. She believed that unions were essential to achieving justice for workers and to creating a more equitable society. While Frances's work was widely praised by labour activists and social reformers, it was not without its critics. Business leaders and conservative politicians, many of whom opposed the New Deal, criticised her for being too radical and too willing to challenge the status quo. But Frances remained unfazed. She knew that the reforms she was pushing for were not just about improving the lives of workers. They were about creating a fairer, more just society for all Americans, and she was willing to face whatever opposition came her way to achieve that goal. Throughout her tenure as Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins remained steadfast in her commitment to social justice and workers' rights. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the labour reforms she championed were implemented and that workers received the protections and benefits they deserved. Her time in office marked a turning point in the history of American labour, and the policies she helped create continue to have a profound impact on the lives of workers today. Frances' appointment as Secretary of Labor was not just a personal achievement, it was a recognition of her years of hard work and dedication to the cause of labour reform. Her leadership and vision helped shape the future of American labour laws and laid the foundation for the modern welfare state. She had spent her career advocating for the rights of workers, and now, as the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States, she was in a position to bring her vision to life on a national scale. Her appointment marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would see her continue to advocate for the rights of workers and the most vulnerable members of society. It was the start of a legacy that would inspire generations of social reformers and labour activists to come. When Frances Perkins was appointed Secretary of Labor in 1933, the United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Unemployment had reached staggering heights, businesses were collapsing, and families were being torn apart by poverty and uncertainty. The government, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had already begun taking steps to address the crisis. But it was clear that much more needed to be done to ensure that the American people could recover and build a more secure future. The New Deal, a series of programs and reforms initiated by Roosevelt, would become the cornerstone of this effort, and Frances Perkins would play a central role in its creation and implementation. The New Deal was designed to address the immediate economic crisis of the Depression, but it also aimed to restructure the American economy and society in ways that would prevent future disasters. It was a bold, ambitious vision, and it required a sweeping transformation of the government's role in people's lives. At the heart of the New Deal was the idea that the government should act as a safety net for the people, providing relief to those who were struggling, creating jobs, and laying the foundation for long-term economic security. For Frances Perkins, the New Deal represented the realization of many of the ideals she had championed throughout her career. She had long believed that the government had a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable members of society, particularly workers. The New Deal gave her the opportunity to put those beliefs into practice on a national scale. As Secretary of Labour, she was in a unique position to advocate for policies that would benefit workers and create a more equitable society. The early days of the New Deal were focused on providing immediate relief to the millions of Americans who were suffering. The Roosevelt administration passed a series of programs designed to provide direct assistance to those in need. Among the first was the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which put young men to work on public works projects such as reforestation and the construction of parks. The Public Works Administration, PWA, followed, creating jobs by funding large-scale infrastructure projects, including roads, bridges, and schools. These programs not only provided jobs, but also helped to restore confidence in the government's ability to address the economic crisis. Frances Perkins played a key role in the development of these programs. As Secretary of Labour, she was instrumental in shaping the policies that would provide jobs and support for workers. She worked closely with Roosevelt and his administration to ensure that the New Deal programs addressed the needs of the working class, and that workers' rights were protected. One of her primary goals was to create jobs that would not only provide immediate relief, but also contribute to the long-term prosperity of the country. While the early New Deal programs focused on relief and recovery, Frances knew that more needed to be done to address the structural problems in the American economy. She understood that lasting change would only come through reform. Reforms that would ensure that workers were paid fair wages, worked in safe conditions, and had access to the benefits they needed to secure their future. This vision would eventually lead to some of the most significant pieces of labour legislation in American history. One of the most important of these reforms was the Social Security Act of 1935. Frances was a key architect of this landmark legislation, which provided a safety net for workers and their families. The Social Security Act established a system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and assistance for dependent children and the disabled. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the government and its citizens. For the first time in American history, the government would be responsible for ensuring that workers had access to basic financial security in times of need. The passage of the Social Security Act was a triumph for Frances and for the New Deal. It was a bold step toward creating a more just and equitable society, one in which the government played an active role in protecting the welfare of its citizens. But the Act was not just about providing financial support. It was about recognizing the dignity and value of workers. Frances understood that by providing a safety net for workers, the government could help restore their sense of security and give them the opportunity to thrive. Frances Perkins also played a key role in the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the 40-hour work week, set a minimum wage, and prohibited child labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act was another milestone in the fight for workers' rights, and it was a direct response to the abuses that had been rampant in American factories during the early years of the 20th century. It was the culmination of decades of advocacy by labor reformers like Frances Perkins, and it was a testament to the power of government intervention in the economy. Through her work on the New Deal, Frances Perkins was able to achieve many of the goals she had set for herself earlier in her career. She had always believed that government could and should act as a force for good, and the New Deal gave her the platform to put those beliefs into action. Her role in shaping the New Deal was not just about passing laws. It was about creating a new vision for the country, one in which the government worked to ensure the well-being of all its citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful. The New Deal was not without its critics, and many business leaders and conservatives opposed the reforms that were being implemented. They argued that the government's intervention in the economy was too heavy-handed, and that it would stifle innovation and economic growth. But Frances Perkins remained steadfast in her belief that the New Deal was the right course of action. She understood that the old system had failed, and that it was time for the government to step in and create a fairer, more just society. As the New Deal progressed, Frances continued to be a tireless advocate for workers and their rights. She worked to ensure that the policies being implemented would not only provide immediate relief, but also set the stage for long-term prosperity. She knew that the work of the New Deal was far from finished, but she was committed to seeing it through. The New Deal was a transformative moment in American history, and Frances Perkins' role in it was pivotal. Her work laid the foundation for many of the labor protections that Americans enjoy today, and it set the stage for future social welfare programs. Through the New Deal, Frances Perkins helped to create a government that was not just a passive observer of the economy, but an active participant in shaping a fairer, more equitable society. The Social Security Act of 1935 was one of the cornerstone achievements of the New Deal, and Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, was instrumental in its creation. This groundbreaking piece of legislation marked a turning point in the American welfare state, establishing systems of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and welfare for children and the disabled. It was a direct response to the economic hardships caused by the Great Depression, and an acknowledgement that the government had a moral obligation to protect its citizens from the ravages of poverty, illness, and old age. For Frances, the Social Security Act was not just another piece of legislation. It was the culmination of decades of work, study, and advocacy for workers' rights. She had long believed that the government had a responsibility to ensure the well-being of its citizens, particularly the most vulnerable. The Depression had only solidified her view that an economic safety net was essential for protecting workers and their families, especially in times of economic crisis. The process of crafting the Social Security Act was neither simple nor quick. The road to passing the bill was fraught with political battles and fierce opposition from various factions. Many business leaders, conservatives, and even some liberals opposed the idea of government intervention in providing financial security to individuals. They argued that the government should not take on such a role, fearing that it would lead to higher taxes and create a dependency on government assistance. Despite these challenges, Frances remained resolute in her belief that Social Security was essential for the health of the nation. She worked tirelessly to build support for the bill, using her position within the Roosevelt administration to persuade lawmakers and the American public of the need for such reforms. Her calm demeanor, extensive knowledge of social issues, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of workers made her a persuasive advocate for the legislation. The Social Security Act's provisions were revolutionary in their scope. One of the most significant elements of the Act was the establishment of the old age pension system. For the first time in American history, workers would be guaranteed an income in their retirement years. The pensions were funded by payroll taxes on workers and employers, creating a self-sustaining system that would provide financial security for future generations. The old age pension system was a direct response to the hardships faced by older Americans, many of whom had lost their savings during the Depression and had no means of support as they aged. In addition to old age pensions, the Social Security Act also established unemployment insurance. This was another critical component of the bill, offering workers who lost their jobs temporary financial assistance while they searched for new employment. The unemployment insurance system provided a safety net for millions of Americans, many of whom were unemployed due to the economic collapse. It was a recognition that the government had a responsibility to ensure that workers who lost their jobs through no fault of their own would not fall into destitution. The Social Security Act also created welfare programs for dependent children and the disabled. These provisions were especially significant for women and children, who were often the most vulnerable members of society. Frances Perkins, deeply committed to the idea of protecting the welfare of families, saw the inclusion of these programs as a key part of the bill. The welfare provisions helped ensure that children and the disabled would not be left without support in times of need. The passing of the Social Security Act was a historic achievement, but it was not the end of Frances Perkins' work. She understood that the Act, while revolutionary, was just the beginning of a broader effort to ensure the economic security of all Americans. She continued to work on expanding the scope of Social Security programs, pushing for greater protections for workers and their families. Her leadership in the passage of the Social Security Act solidified her place in American history and made her one of the foremost advocates for social welfare in the country. The Social Security Act of 1935 fundamentally changed the relationship between the American government and its citizens. It marked a shift toward a more active role for the government in providing economic security and welfare. The Act laid the foundation for many of the social programs that would follow, including Medicare, Medicaid, and the broader social safety net that Americans rely on today. It was one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation in the history of the United States, and Frances Perkins played a pivotal role in its creation. As Frances reflected on the passage of the Social Security Act in later years, she would have recognized it as one of her greatest accomplishments. It was the product of years of hard work, perseverance, and a steadfast belief in the power of government to create positive change. The Act, along with the other New Deal reforms, helped to lift the country out of the darkest days of the Depression and provided a framework for a more just and equitable society. The Social Security Act not only transformed the American welfare state, but also had a profound impact on the lives of millions of Americans. For the first time in the country's history, workers had access to retirement benefits and unemployment insurance, and families were assured that their children and disabled members would not be left behind. It was a safety net that protected the most vulnerable members of society and gave them the opportunity to build a better future. Frances Perkins' role in the creation of the Social Security Act was a defining moment in her life and career. It was the realization of her vision for a more just and compassionate society, one in which the government took an active role in ensuring that all Americans had access to the resources they needed to thrive. Her work on the Social Security Act solidified her legacy as one of the most influential figures in the history of American social policy and labor reform. As the Great Depression continued to unfold, the need for comprehensive labor reform became ever more apparent. While many of the New Deal programs focused on relief and recovery, Frances Perkins was determined that the nation's economic recovery should also include protections for workers that would last long after the immediate crisis had passed. She believed that the way to ensure long-term prosperity was to secure the rights and dignity of workers, ensuring they were paid fairly and treated with respect. One of France's key achievements as Secretary of Labor was her advocacy for minimum wage laws and labor reforms. These laws were designed to ensure that workers received fair pay for their labor, with the goal of reducing the exploitation that had plagued the American workforce for decades. At a time when many workers were still earning wages that barely covered their living expenses, the introduction of minimum wage laws was revolutionary. These reforms were part of a broader effort to create a more just society, one where all people, regardless of their social or economic background, could work and live with dignity. The fight for a national minimum wage was not an easy one. Business leaders and conservatives in Congress opposed such reforms, arguing that a minimum wage would hurt businesses and stifle economic growth. They feared that setting a wage floor would lead to higher costs and reduce the number of jobs available to workers. Despite this opposition, Frances was resolute in her belief that the government had a responsibility to ensure that workers were not paid below a fair and livable wage. She knew that workers needed more than just jobs. They needed jobs that could support them and their families. The debate over minimum wage laws was closely tied to the broader discussion surrounding the New Deal. As Frances worked to secure these laws, she had to navigate a complex political landscape. Roosevelt and his administration were fully supportive of labor reforms, but many other politicians, particularly those from business-friendly factions, resisted the changes. Frances often found herself at odds with powerful interest groups, yet she remained steadfast in her mission to protect workers. In 1938, after years of lobbying and negotiation, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, was passed. The FLSA established the first federal minimum wage, setting the wage floor at 25 cents an hour, and it also limited the work week to 44 hours, eventually reducing it to 40 hours by 1940. The act also prohibited child labor in most industries, setting a minimum age for employment The passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act was a monumental victory for Frances Perkins and for the labour movement, and it marked a key moment in the fight for workers' rights in the United States. The minimum wage law, while modest by today's standards, had a profound impact on the lives of millions of American workers. It helped to reduce the exploitation of labour in the lowest-paying industries and provided workers with a sense of security. The establishment of a minimum wage also set a precedent for future wage increases and reforms, as it became clear that the government had a role in ensuring that workers were compensated fairly. In addition to the minimum wage provisions, the Fair Labor Standards Act also introduced other important labour protections, including restrictions on overtime pay and the regulation of working hours. These protections helped to prevent the overwork and exploitation that had been common in factories and other industries prior to the passage of the Act. For Frances Perkins, the success of the FLSA was a major victory, not only for workers but for the New Deal vision of a more just and equitable society. The labour reforms that Frances championed went beyond just the minimum wage laws. She also worked tirelessly to improve the safety and working conditions in factories and other industries. Her commitment to improving the lives of workers was evident in her advocacy for workplace safety regulations, which included requirements for better ventilation, sanitation, and fire safety. These reforms helped to reduce workplace accidents and improve the overall quality of life for workers. France's efforts in securing labour reforms were not without their challenges. She faced fierce opposition from business interests, many of whom saw her proposals as a threat to their profits. However, she remained undeterred. Her belief in the importance of protecting workers, especially those at the bottom of the economic ladder, was unshakable. Frances knew that the fight for labour rights was not just about passing laws. It was about ensuring that every worker had access to fair wages, safe working conditions, and the dignity they deserved. In her later years, as Frances reflected on her career, she would often point to the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the establishment of the minimum wage as one of her proudest achievements. These reforms, she believed, were not just a victory for labour, they were a victory for the American people, and for the idea that every person, regardless of their station in life, deserves to be treated with respect and fairness. The legacy of Frances Perkins' work on labour reforms continues to be felt today. The minimum wage laws and labour protections she helped establish laid the foundation for the labour rights movements of the 20th century and continue to shape the lives of workers across the country. Her commitment to creating a fairer, more just society remains a model for future generations of social reformers, and her impact on labour law and workers' rights is one of the most significant in American history. The passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, in 1938 was a watershed moment in the history of American labour law and one of the most significant achievements of Frances Perkins' career. As Secretary of Labour, she had worked tirelessly to push for policies that would protect workers from exploitation and ensure that all Americans could earn fair wages and work in safe conditions. The FLSA was the culmination of these efforts and a testament to France's unwavering commitment to social justice. Before the passage of the FLSA, there were few federal laws regulating working conditions in the United States. Many workers were subjected to grueling hours, dangerous conditions, and low wages, with little recourse for improving their situations. The Great Depression had exacerbated these issues, leaving millions of Americans unemployed and desperate for any work they could find. Frances Perkins understood that a fundamental shift was needed, a shift that would ensure that workers were not only protected but also valued. The FLSA had several key provisions that would lay the foundation for a fairer labour system. First and foremost, it established a national minimum wage, setting the wage floor at 25 cents an hour. While this amount may seem modest by today's standards, it was a revolutionary step at the time. For the first time in US history, workers were guaranteed a wage that ensured they could meet their basic needs. The minimum wage was intended to provide workers with the dignity of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and it marked the beginning of the government's active role in regulating wages. In addition to the minimum wage, the FLSA also established maximum workweek hours. The Act limited the workweek to 44 hours, with the expectation that it would eventually be reduced to 40 hours. This provision was groundbreaking, as it helped curb the excessive hours that many workers were forced to work, often without overtime pay. The establishment of the 40-hour workweek became a cornerstone of modern labour rights, ensuring that workers could maintain a better work-life balance and avoid the physical toll of endless hours in grueling conditions. Perhaps most notably, the Fair Labour Standards Act included provisions that banned child labour in many industries. This was an incredibly important victory, especially for young children who were often forced to work in factories, mines, and farms under dangerous conditions. By restricting child labour, the FLSA helped ensure that children could receive an education and grow up free from exploitation. The law also introduced regulations on the employment of young workers, ensuring that they would be protected from hazardous jobs and could work only under limited conditions. The passage of the Fair Labour Standards Act was not an easy victory. As with many of the reforms Frances Perkins championed, the FLSA faced significant opposition from business leaders, conservative politicians, and those who feared the economic consequences of government intervention in the labour market. Critics argued that setting a minimum wage and limiting work hours would increase costs for employers and lead to job losses. Some even feared that the act would undermine the free market economy. But Frances remained steadfast in her belief that the government had a responsibility to protect its workers. She knew that the FLSA was not just about setting wage limits, it was about ensuring that American workers were treated with respect and dignity. The government, she argued, had a moral obligation to intervene on behalf of those who had been exploited for far too long. She faced down the opposition with calm determination, working tirelessly behind the scenes to build support for the legislation. France's advocacy for the FLSA was also part of a larger effort to secure workers' rights across the country. She understood that labour laws could not be left to individual states or companies to enforce. They had to be national in scope, ensuring that all workers, regardless of where they lived, had access to the same basic protections. The FLSA was not just about fixing the labour market, it was about laying the groundwork for a more just and equitable society. When the Fair Labour Standards Act was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 25, 1938, it was a victory for Frances Perkins and the labour movement, but it was also a victory for all workers in the United States. The law provided concrete protections for workers, guaranteeing that they would receive fair wages, be limited in the number of hours they could work, and, most importantly, be given the rights they had long been denied. The FLSA marked a turning point in the history of American labour. It set a national standard for worker protections that would shape labour law for decades to come. It also laid the groundwork for future reforms, including the expansion of the minimum wage and the eventual inclusion of more workers under the law's protections. It was a first step in ensuring that labour rights were enshrined in law and that workers had a voice in the policies that affected their lives. For Frances Perkins, the passage of the Fair Labour Standards Act was not just a career achievement, it was a personal triumph. It was the culmination of her lifelong work on behalf of workers, and it represented the realization of her belief that government could be a force for good in creating a fairer, more just society. The Act was one of the most significant victories of the New Deal, and Frances's role in its passage cemented her place in history as one of the foremost advocates for workers' rights in the United States. In the years that followed, Frances would continue to advocate for workers, ensuring that the labour reforms of the New Deal were upheld and expanded. But the Fair Labour Standards Act of 1938 remained one of her most enduring legacies, a law that continues to shape the lives of American workers to this day. Throughout her career, Frances Perkins faced considerable opposition, often from powerful business leaders, conservative lawmakers, and those who feared the changes she was advocating for. The labour reforms she championed, particularly the creation of minimum wage laws, child labour protections and workplace safety regulations were seen as controversial, even radical, by many of her critics. Yet Perkins remained unwavering in her commitment to social justice and workers' rights, navigating the political landscape with patience, diplomacy, and an unshakable belief in the need for systemic change. The Fair Labour Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938, which established the first federal minimum wage and regulated working hours, was perhaps the most notable example of the opposition Francis encountered. Business leaders, who often viewed labour protections as an infringement on their profits, fought fiercely against the law. They argued that raising wages and limiting working hours would increase costs, reduce employment opportunities, and undermine the free market economy. Some even argued that the government should not be involved in regulating labour markets at all, fearing that such interventions would lead to a loss of American individualism and entrepreneurial spirit. Francis, however, understood that these arguments were rooted in a long history of exploitation and inequality. She saw firsthand how workers, especially those at the bottom of the economic ladder, had been treated as expendable, forced to work in dangerous conditions for little pay and with no safety nets to fall back on. She knew that the government's role was not just to promote economic growth, but to ensure that the benefits of that growth were shared equitably. Her ability to stand up to opposition and continue pushing for the changes she believed in was one of the hallmarks of her career. Despite the resistance, she remained calm and focused, continually reiterating her belief that labour laws were essential not only to protect workers, but to stabilise the economy. Francis knew that if workers were paid fairly and treated with dignity, they would have the purchasing power to contribute to the economy, creating a cycle of prosperity that benefited everyone, not just the wealthy few. At times, Francis' resolve was tested. The debates surrounding the New Deal and the labour reform she championed were often heated, and she faced criticism from both the right and the left. Some conservative politicians viewed her as a threat to the free market economy, while some progressives believed that the New Deal did not go far enough in addressing economic inequality. Despite these pressures, Francis remained steadfast in her belief that government intervention was necessary to protect the most vulnerable members of society. She refused to be swayed by those who sought to maintain the status quo, and her determination to push for lasting change remained unshaken. One of the most difficult moments in her career came when Francis had to navigate the political fallout from the rise of labour strikes during the 1930s. As more workers sought to organise for better wages and conditions, tensions between labour unions and business owners reached a boiling point. Francis was caught in the middle of these tensions, as she was expected to support both labour and business interests. Her role was to advocate for fair labour practices without undermining the economy, a delicate balancing act that often placed her at odds with powerful corporate interests. In the face of strikes and protests, Francis worked tirelessly to mediate between labour unions and business owners, pushing for both sides to come to the negotiating table. She was committed to ensuring that workers' rights to organise and demand better conditions were respected, while also understanding the economic pressures businesses were facing. She advocated for policies that would protect both the workers and the businesses that employed them, understanding that a healthy economy required cooperation and compromise. Despite the challenges she faced, Francis' reputation as a principled and effective advocate for workers continued to grow. Her ability to stand up to opposition while maintaining a sense of calm and reason earned her the respect of both her allies and her adversaries. Her leadership during these contentious times helped to shape the future of labour policy in the United States, ensuring that the rights of workers were enshrined in law and that businesses were held accountable for the conditions they provided. Throughout her time as Secretary of Labour, Francis faced opposition from powerful political forces, yet her unwavering commitment to social justice and workers' rights remained unbroken. She understood that reform often comes with resistance, but she also knew that it was through perseverance and dedication that true change could be achieved. The laws she helped pass, the Fair Labour Standards Act, the Social Security Act and others, were the direct result of her willingness to stand up to opposition and fight for the values she believed in. Frances Perkins's legacy as a labour reformer is not just about the laws she helped create. It is also about her courage in the face of adversity. She was a tireless advocate for workers, pushing back against the forces of exploitation and inequality with a quiet but fierce determination. Her ability to navigate the challenges of her time, balancing the needs of workers, business, and government, set her apart as one of the most influential figures in American social and labour policy. By the late 1930s, the United States had emerged from the depths of the Great Depression, thanks in part to the bold policies of the New Deal. But just as the country was beginning to recover, another global crisis loomed on the horizon. World War II, which began in 1939, would change the world forever, and Frances Perkins, now deeply embedded in the Roosevelt administration, would play a key role in managing the labour aspects of the war effort. The entry of the United States into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was a momentous event that transformed the economy and society. The war effort required the mobilization of millions of workers to produce weapons, supplies, and materials needed for the military. Industries that had been stagnating just a few years earlier now found themselves working at full capacity to meet the demands of war. Factories, shipyards, and military installations sprang up across the country as part of the war mobilization. Frances Perkins, in her role as Secretary of Labour, was tasked with overseeing this massive shift in the labour force. The war effort required not just soldiers but also workers, men and women, who would be responsible for producing everything from tanks to ammunition to ships. Frances's challenge was to ensure that the country had the workers it needed to support the war effort, while also protecting the rights and well-being of these workers in a time of extraordinary pressure. The first major challenge Frances faced was addressing the labour shortage that accompanied the war effort. With so many men being drafted into military service, industries needed workers to fill the vacant positions. To meet the demand for labour, Frances supported the expansion of programs like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, which brought women into factories, shipyards, and other industrial settings. This marked a major shift in American society as millions of women entered the workforce in roles they had never filled before. Frances was a passionate advocate for the fair treatment of these workers, especially women. She recognized that while the war effort required unprecedented contributions from women, many industries were still not prepared to provide adequate wages, benefits, or working conditions. Frances fought to ensure that women workers were paid fair wages and received the same protections as their male counterparts. Her efforts helped to ensure that the women who were supporting the war effort were treated with dignity and respect. Alongside the efforts to recruit and protect women workers, Frances was also concerned with ensuring that the existing workforce, both men and women, was treated fairly. The war economy brought about rapid changes in industrial production, and workers faced long hours, intense pressure, and in some cases dangerous working conditions. Frances was determined to make sure that labour laws that had been enacted during the New Deal, such as the Fair Labour Standards Act, were upheld, even in the context of wartime mobilisation. One of the key issues Frances had to address was the balance between the demands of the war effort and the rights of workers. With industries working at full capacity, workers often found themselves facing grueling hours and exhausting workloads. Frances pushed for the continuation of the labour standards and the protection of workers' rights, even in the context of wartime production. This included advocating for fair wages, safe working conditions, and the ability of workers to organise into unions if they chose. Frances also played a crucial role in labour relations during the war. The war effort required unprecedented cooperation between the government, labour unions, and business leaders. Frances worked tirelessly to foster collaboration and prevent labour disputes from hindering the production of vital war materials. She understood that the success of the war effort depended on the ability of workers and employers to work together toward a common goal. Her efforts to maintain harmony between labour unions and business leaders were instrumental in ensuring that strikes and other labour disruptions were kept to a minimum during the war years. The establishment of the War Labour Board in 1942 helped mediate disputes and enforce fair labour practices across the country. Francis worked closely with the board to ensure that the interests of workers were represented and that the war effort could proceed without disruption. Throughout the war, Francis Perkins remained a steady and calming presence in the Roosevelt administration, while others focused on military strategy and the larger global conflict. Francis was focused on the home front, on ensuring that workers had the resources they needed to support the war effort. Her dedication to protecting the rights of workers, even in the face of unprecedented challenges, was a testament to her belief in the importance of social justice and the government's responsibility to protect its citizens, no matter the circumstances. As the war progressed and the United States emerged as a global superpower, Francis Perkins' role in shaping the nation's labour policies became even more significant. Her advocacy for workers during the war helped to cement her legacy as one of the most influential labour reformers in American history. The labour policies she helped shape during World War II were not just about responding to a crisis. They were about laying the foundation for a more just and equitable society that would continue to benefit workers long after the war had ended. France's work during World War II would prove to be one of the defining periods of her career. She faced enormous challenges, but she met them with the same calm determination that had marked her entire career. Through her leadership, Francis helped ensure that workers were treated fairly during one of the most turbulent times in American history, and she continued to advocate for labour rights long after the war was over. The war effort not only transformed the American economy, but it also transformed the role of women in the workforce. Francis Perkins was at the forefront of this transformation, ensuring that women who entered the workforce during the war were paid fairly, treated with respect, and given the rights they deserved. Her efforts during World War II would have lasting effects on labour policy and women's rights in the United States, helping to shape the future of work in the country. Francis Perkins' rise to prominence in the political world was a remarkable achievement, especially considering the challenges she faced as a woman in a predominantly male-dominated field. From the moment she was appointed as Secretary of Labour by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, she encountered resistance, not only because of her progressive ideas, but also because of her gender. Yet, throughout her career, Francis proved that her resolve, intellect, and commitment to social justice could overcome the barriers that society placed before her. Francis was well aware of the obstacles that women faced in the workplace and in political life. She'd spent much of her career advocating for workers, especially women and children, and she knew firsthand the discrimination that women faced in both the labour market and in politics. As a woman in a high-ranking government position, she was constantly scrutinised. In many ways, she had to work twice as hard as her male counterparts to be taken seriously, and yet she managed to secure a legacy that would forever alter the landscape of American labour laws and social welfare. One of the greatest challenges Francis faced was the general perception of women in leadership roles. In the early 20th century, women were still considered to be unsuitable for positions of political power, especially those that required hard decision-making and public visibility. The idea that a woman could hold a cabinet-level position was for many inconceivable. Some critics questioned whether Francis was qualified for the position of Secretary of Labour, dismissing her as a figurehead or a token appointment to appease women's rights advocates. Despite this, Francis did not let these doubts deter her. She knew that her experience and passion for labour reform were more important than the prejudices others held against her gender. She carried herself with quiet dignity, navigating the difficult political terrain of the time with grace and determination. Francis had a clear mission. She wanted to reshape the relationship between the American government and its workers, and nothing was going to stand in her way, not even the deeply entrenched gender norms of her time. Her ability to balance the expectations placed on her as both a woman and a leader in government was one of her most impressive feats. Francis was highly intelligent, methodical, and deeply committed to the work she did, but she also had to be extraordinarily tactful in order to maintain her position. she frequently had to prove herself in ways that her male colleagues did not. Whether that meant advocating for policies that were unpopular with business leaders or finding ways to avoid personal attacks on her character. One of the areas in which Frances Perkins faced significant gender-based challenges was in her relationships with business leaders. Many in the corporate world were skeptical of her, viewing her as a threat to their profits and an unqualified woman in a position of power. As she worked to pass progressive labour laws such as the Fair Labour Standards Act, the minimum wage laws, and child labour protections, she encountered resistance from business interests who felt that such reforms would increase their costs and hurt the economy. Frances, however, approached these challenges with the quiet determination that was characteristic of her career. She understood that it would take more than just hard work to get her policies passed. It would take strategic diplomacy and careful negotiation. Frances was skilled at building alliances with those who were initially skeptical of her. She had a unique ability to work with people from different political backgrounds, whether they were labour union leaders, business owners, or conservative lawmakers. This ability to bring people together to find common ground despite differences was essential in securing the labour reforms that would later become part of the foundation of the New Deal. Though some might have doubted her leadership ability due to her gender, those who worked closely with her recognized her unparalleled intelligence, strategic thinking, and dedication to the causes she championed. Another aspect of Frances' work that often placed her at odds with the political establishment was her advocacy for women's rights. Although she was committed to improving conditions for all workers, she also understood the unique challenges faced by women in the workforce. She fought tirelessly for better wages and working conditions for women, who were often paid less than men for the same work and subjected to gender-based discrimination. She worked to ensure that women would have access to fair wages, maternity leave, and better working conditions, and she believed that their contributions to the economy were just as valuable as those of men. Frances also worked to expand opportunities for women in government. At a time when women were still excluded from many professional fields, Frances sought to create a path for other women to follow. She believed that women had unique perspectives and skills to offer in political and social reform, and she was determined to ensure that they had a voice in the policies that shaped the nation. Despite the many obstacles she faced, Frances' work had a lasting impact on women's rights in the United States. Her role as the first female Secretary of Labour demonstrated to the world that women were capable of holding powerful positions in government, and her advocacy for labour laws and social welfare programs benefited women across the country. Frances also paved the way for future generations of women in politics, demonstrating that gender should never be a barrier to leadership. In her later years, as Frances reflected on her career, she often spoke about the challenges she had faced as a woman in a male-dominated political world. She acknowledged that gender played a role in the obstacles she encountered, but she never allowed it to define her work or limit her ambitions. Instead, she channeled her energy into the causes she believed in and continued to break down barriers for women, workers, and marginalized communities. Frances Perkins' legacy is not just about the laws she helped pass or the social programs she helped create. It is also about the path she forged for women in leadership. She proved that a woman could be both a fierce advocate for social change and an effective leader in government. She demonstrated that women had the power to shape the future of their country, and her work continues to inspire women in politics and public service today. Throughout her career, Frances Perkins faced many struggles, not just from the external opposition to her progressive labour reforms, but also from the political pressures and personal challenges that often accompany a life spent in public service. She had to balance the intense demands of her work with her personal life, all while navigating the complex world of American politics. Yet despite these challenges, Frances remained a steadfast and unwavering advocate for workers' rights, social welfare, and the broader ideals of justice and fairness. One of the most significant personal struggles Frances faced was the tension between her work and her family life. Frances had married Paul Wilson, a college professor, in 1913. Together they had a daughter, but their marriage faced immense strain, partly due to the immense pressure Frances faced in her professional life. The challenges of maintaining a family while building a career in the male-dominated world of politics were never easy. Frances often felt the weight of these competing responsibilities, but she remained deeply committed to her work in a way that few others could understand. Her marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1929, after years of emotional and personal struggles. Despite the toll that these personal challenges took on her, Frances remained undeterred in her mission. The divorce, while difficult, also allowed her to focus even more intensely on her career and the causes that were so important to her. She knew that the work she was doing was not just about political power. It was about improving the lives of working people and ensuring that the United States could become a fairer, more just society. At the same time, Frances had to contend with the political challenges that came with her position. The world of politics was often hostile to her progressive views, and Frances was frequently forced to defend her Labour policies from business interests, conservative politicians, and even members of her own party who disagreed with her approach. She faced fierce criticism from many sides, especially as she advocated for sweeping changes to labour laws that would empower workers and create a stronger social safety net. One of the most challenging moments of Frances' career came during the debate over the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935. Although the bill was ultimately one of the most significant legislative achievements of the New Deal, it faced strong opposition from various factions, including conservatives who believed the government should not provide direct support to individuals. Frances had to work tirelessly to navigate these political pressures, building support for the bill and addressing the concerns of critics. She encountered harsh criticism from conservative politicians who saw the bill as a step towards socialism, and from some business leaders who feared that the new programs would hurt their bottom line. Yet throughout the political battles, Frances never wavered in her belief that the government had a responsibility to ensure that every American had access to basic economic security. She used her calm, diplomatic manner to engage with her critics, always emphasizing the need for reforms that would help not just the working class but society as a whole. Her ability to hold firm in the face of intense political pressure earned her the respect of her colleagues, even those who disagreed with her. In addition to the personal and political challenges, Frances also faced the emotional toll of seeing many of her reforms come under attack in the years following their passage. While the New Deal brought lasting change, it also sparked a backlash from some sectors of society who resented the government's expanded role in the economy. In particular, the rise of anti-union sentiment in the late 1930s and early 1940s posed a challenge to many of the labour reforms Frances had championed. Business interests, eager to roll back some of the regulations that had been put in place during the New Deal, worked to diminish the power of labour unions and undermine the progress that had been made for workers. Frances was deeply affected by the resistance to the changes she'd fought for, but she remained resolute in her commitment to protecting the rights of workers. She knew that the fight for social justice was a long one, and she understood that setbacks and opposition were inevitable. What mattered was not whether her policies were always popular, but whether they made a lasting difference in the lives of the people they were meant to help. Throughout her career, Frances maintained a clear focus on her mission, improving the lives of workers, especially the most vulnerable, and ensuring that the benefits of progress were shared by all. Despite the difficulties, Frances' political and personal struggles were not without moments of triumph. The New Deal reforms that she helped craft laid the foundation for a more secure and just society, and her leadership in shaping the labour policies of the 20th century remains one of her most enduring legacies. Her work on the Social Security Act, the Fair Labour Standards Act, and other key pieces of legislation continues to shape the lives of Americans today. In her later years, Frances reflected on the emotional toll of her career, recognizing that her work had often come at a personal cost. She had sacrificed a great deal for the causes she believed in, and while she was proud of the progress she'd made, she was also acutely aware of the toll it had taken on her personal life. Yet, despite the hardships, Frances never regretted the path she had chosen. She'd spent her life fighting for a fairer, more just society, and she knew that the work she'd done had made a lasting difference. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 brought with it a period of great transformation for both the United States and France's Perkins. The war had dramatically reshaped the American economy, with millions of jobs created, wages rising, and the country's industrial base expanding rapidly. Yet, as the war came to an end, many of the problems that Frances had been addressing throughout her career, poverty, inequality, and discrimination, remained unresolved. For Frances, the post-war years were a time to continue pushing for meaningful change, particularly in the areas of civil rights and labour reform. Although Frances had been an influential figure in labour reform, her focus after the war began to expand to encompass the broader civil rights movement. She had long been committed to the principle that all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or background, should have equal rights and opportunities. The post-war years were a time of great social and political upheaval, as the United States faced the challenges of integrating millions of returning soldiers, addressing the needs of a growing population, and confronting the racial inequalities that had long been entrenched in the nation's social fabric. Frances was keenly aware that the fight for civil rights was closely tied to the economic struggles of the working class. She understood that true equality could not be achieved without economic justice, and she was determined to continue her work to create a more equitable society for all. The economic prosperity of the post-war years had not been shared equally, and Frances knew that much work remained to be done to ensure that the benefits of that prosperity reached every corner of American society, especially for Black Americans, who had faced centuries of systemic oppression. One of the key issues that Frances focused on in the post-war years was the protection of workers' rights in a changing economy. She was deeply concerned that, as the economy shifted from wartime production to peacetime growth, workers could easily be forgotten or left behind. The gains made during the New Deal, such as the establishment of a minimum wage, labour protections and social security, were threatened by a post-war business boom that focused primarily on profits, often at the expense of workers. Frances continued to advocate for stronger labour protections in the years after the war, fighting to maintain and expand the gains that had been made during the New Deal. She understood that the labour movement was an essential part of ensuring that workers received fair wages and benefits, and she worked tirelessly to support labour unions and protect workers' rights. She also pushed for policies that would ensure fair housing and better access to education, recognising that these issues were key to achieving true equality for all Americans. Frances's advocacy for civil rights was also a significant part of her post-war work. Although the civil rights movement was still in its early stages, Frances recognised the importance of addressing racial discrimination, particularly in the workplace. She understood that racial inequality was not just a social issue but also an economic one, and that the full potential of American workers could only be realised if Black Americans were given the same opportunities as their white counterparts. Throughout her career, Frances had been a staunch advocate for equal rights for women, and in the post-war years she expanded her focus to include racial justice. She fought to ensure that Black Americans had access to the same labour protections and social welfare programs as white Americans, and she worked to address discriminatory practices that prevented Black workers from enjoying the same opportunities for economic advancement. Frances was also a supporter of the labour movement's efforts to combat racial discrimination in the workplace. She recognised that the struggle for labour rights and the struggle for civil rights were deeply interconnected, and she was committed to advocating for policies that would ensure racial and economic justice for all workers. Her work in this area helped to lay the groundwork for the broader civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the 1950s and 1960s. Despite the challenges she faced in the post-war years, Frances remained a tireless advocate for the rights of workers and marginalised communities. She continued to push for the passage of laws that would protect the most vulnerable members of society, and she was steadfast in her belief that the government had a moral obligation to ensure the well-being of its citizens. Her work in the post-war years laid the foundation for many of the social reforms that would come in the 1960s and beyond, including the civil rights legislation that would eventually outlaw discrimination based on race, gender, and other factors. Frances Perkins' post-war work was not as high-profile as her role during the New Deal, but it was no less significant. She continued to work behind the scenes, advocating for policies that would protect workers and expand civil rights. While she did not have the same political influence she had enjoyed during her time as Secretary of Labour, Frances remained a key figure in the ongoing struggle for social and economic justice. Her work during the post-war period also allowed her to reflect on the legacy she had created. She had spent her life advocating for the rights of workers, and while there was still much to be done, she could look back on her career with pride. Frances had helped to lay the foundation for a fairer, more just society, and her contributions would continue to shape the future of American labour laws and civil rights for generations to come. On May 14, 1965, Frances Perkins passed away at the age of 85. Her death marked the end of a remarkable career, one that had shaped the very foundations of American labour law and social welfare. By the time of her passing, Frances had achieved a legacy that few others could match. She had been the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States, had helped create the Social Security system, and had been an unwavering advocate for workers' rights, women's rights, and economic justice. Her death came at a time when many of the reforms she had championed had become integral parts of American society. The labour protections, minimum wage laws, and social security system were all firmly in place, and many of the social policies that she had worked so hard to implement continued to benefit millions of Americans. Yet even as her work became institutionalized, her passing left a void. Frances was not just a policymaker. She was a fierce advocate, a voice for the powerless, and a woman who had dedicated her life to making the world a fairer place. In the immediate aftermath of her death, tributes poured in from all corners of the nation. Labour unions, civil rights organisations, and political leaders hailed her as one of the most influential social reformers in US history. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president she had worked so closely with during the New Deal, had passed away decades earlier. But his legacy, in part, was also hers. The New Deal policies they had worked to pass together had changed the face of America, lifting millions out of poverty and establishing a social safety net that continues to protect Americans today. Many of her colleagues and allies reflected on how she had quietly reshaped American life, often working behind the scenes to ensure that labour laws and social policies benefited the nation's most vulnerable citizens. Frances had always been a measured, calm figure, someone who preferred to let her work speak for itself rather than seeking personal glory. She had never sought fame or recognition, yet her impact on American society was profound. As the nation mourned her death, many of the people who had worked with Frances reflected on her integrity, her sharp intellect, and her commitment to justice. Despite the political battles she had fought, Frances was not a figure known for personal animosity. Her opponents respected her, even if they disagreed with her views. She had worked tirelessly to build consensus and to achieve the best possible outcomes for workers, and in the process, she had earned the admiration of nearly everyone she encountered. Frances' passing also marked the end of an era in American labour politics. While her work had already become deeply embedded in the fabric of American life, the political landscape was beginning to shift. The post-war period saw a growing conservative movement that would later challenge many of the labour policies she had fought so hard to establish. Yet, Frances's influence remained undeniable. The programs she had helped create, especially Social Security, continued to provide economic security to millions of Americans, and the labour reform she had fought for remained an essential part of the country's social contract. In the years following her death, Frances Perkins' legacy only grew. She had been a pioneering force in labour rights and social welfare, and her influence was felt in the passage of key civil rights and labour legislation in the 1960s and beyond. The programs she had championed became the foundation for many of the social reforms that would define the mid-20th century, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Her death also sparked renewed interest in her life's work. Scholars, journalists, and labour activists began to look back on her career and recognise her as one of the central figures in the history of American social reform. Books were written about her, and her role in shaping the New Deal and the post-war welfare state was re-evaluated in a new light. She was recognised not just for her pioneering role as the first woman in a US cabinet position, but also for her instrumental role in creating a social safety net that would protect generations of Americans. The memory of Frances Perkins continued to be celebrated by those who shared her commitment to social justice. Labour unions, progressive politicians, and civil rights leaders all found inspiration in her tireless advocacy for workers and her belief that the government had a responsibility to protect its citizens. Frances Perkins was remembered as a woman who had not only shaped the future of American labour and social welfare policies, but had also opened doors for future generations of women to serve in positions of power and influence. Though Frances Perkins passed away in 1965, the work she did during her lifetime continued to inspire. Her efforts to protect the rights of workers and create a fairer, more just society had left an indelible mark on American history, and her legacy remained a guiding light for social reformers and activists in the decades that followed. She had been a quiet force for change, and her contributions to American society would continue to shape the country for years to come. After Frances Perkins passed away in 1965, the recognition of her work and the lasting impact she had on American society only grew stronger with time. Though much of her life was spent quietly working behind the scenes, her legacy as a labour reformer, advocate for workers, and first woman to serve in a US cabinet position became central to the story of the New Deal and the creation of the modern American welfare state. As the decades passed, Frances's work began to be increasingly viewed as foundational to the nation's social safety net. The laws and policies she helped implement, such as the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and labor protections for women, had shaped the lives of millions of Americans and had laid the groundwork for future reforms. By the time of her death, Frances had already earned her place in history, but in the years following, her importance became even clearer. One of the most significant ways Frances' legacy was recognized came in the form of posthumous honors and tributes. In 1966, the year following her death, the Frances Perkins Building in Washington, D.C. was named in her honor. This was a fitting tribute to a woman who had dedicated her career to improving the lives of workers and who had worked within the halls of government to create lasting reforms that continue to protect American citizens to this day. The building housed the U.S. Department of Labor, where Frances had served for over a decade, and its dedication was a reflection of her legacy in the field of labor reform. Frances' contributions were also recognized by labor unions, social justice organizations, and women's groups, many of whom saw her as a trailblazer and a role model. Frances' work had not only improved labor rights, but had also paved the way for women to enter politics and assume leadership roles in the public sector. Her appointment as Secretary of Labor was a groundbreaking achievement in itself, but it was also an inspiration for future generations of women who saw that it was possible to make meaningful contributions to society, regardless of gender. Frances Perkins demonstrated that women could not only participate in the political process, but could also become powerful agents of change within it. For labour activists, Frances Perkins was a hero. Her advocacy for the rights of workers, especially the most vulnerable, was a model for future generations of labour leaders. The minimum wage laws, child labour protections, and social security programs she helped put in place during the New Deal were crucial in securing a better future for workers and their families. In addition, her steadfast commitment to maintaining these protections, even during the rise of post-war conservatism, showed that she was unwavering in her dedication to social justice. In the years following her death, many began to look back on Frances Perkins' career and recognize her as one of the most influential figures in American history. She'd spent her life fighting for the rights of working people, advocating for the most vulnerable members of society, and using her position to enact transformative social policies. Frances had achieved what few could have imagined for a woman of her time. She had reshaped American labor law, fought for equal rights for women, and played a pivotal role in creating the foundation for the modern welfare state. Her influence extended beyond the boundaries of the labor movement. She had been a guiding force in shaping social policies that were central to the New Deal and its lasting legacy. Social security, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation, programs that are still integral to the American social safety net today, were largely the result of Frances Perkins' vision and advocacy. She had helped create a system that provided economic security to millions of Americans, helping them weather the storms of unemployment, old age, and disability. In addition to her role in shaping social policy, Frances' career also paved the way for women in leadership. Her appointment as the first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet position was a watershed moment in American politics. Though she faced challenges and resistance throughout her career, she was a trailblazer for women in public office. Her work showed that women could serve at the highest levels of government and make lasting, impactful changes to society. Her example inspired countless women who followed in her footsteps and worked to achieve similar success in politics, law, and public service. Scholars, too, began to reassess Frances Perkins' contributions in the years following her death. Historians and political analysts began to recognize that her role in the New Deal and in shaping labor policy had been more significant than initially thought. Frances had not only helped to craft the policies that defined the era, but had also fought fiercely to protect them from opposition in the years that followed. Her efforts were foundational to the success of the New Deal, and her work set the stage for many of the labor and social welfare reforms of the mid-20th century. The recognition of Frances Perkins' legacy continued into the 21st century. In 2010, President Barack Obama honored her memory by awarding her a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. The award recognized her tireless work to improve the lives of American workers and her instrumental role in shaping the policies that continue to serve the American people. It was a fitting tribute to a woman whose work had changed the course of history and whose contributions continue to impact generations of Americans. Frances' legacy is not just about the laws she helped create or the policies she shaped. It's also about the doors she opened for future generations of women and workers. Her career demonstrated that government could be a force for good, that it could be used to protect workers' rights, improve living conditions, and provide economic security for those who need it most. Her work laid the foundation for a more just and equitable society, and her example continues to inspire those who seek to make the world a better place for all people, regardless of their background or circumstances. As Frances Perkins neared the end of her career, she began to reflect on the impact of the New Deal and her role in shaping its policies. She'd spent much of her life advocating for labor reforms, social security, and workers' rights. Now, in her later years, she could look back on the sweeping changes she had helped bring about: the creation of the social security system, the establishment of the minimum wage, the end of child labor, and the broad expansion of labor rights. These were not just pieces of legislation. They were the foundation of a new social contract between the government and the people, a commitment that the state would ensure the well-being of all its citizens, particularly those most vulnerable. The New Deal was a response to the devastation of the Great Depression, but it was also a bold vision for the future. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was in the midst of an economic crisis that had left millions unemployed, homeless, and struggling to survive. Roosevelt's administration, with Frances Perkins at its helm as Secretary of Labor, recognized that the government could not stand by and watch as its citizens suffered. The New Deal was a comprehensive plan to address the immediate needs of the people, while also laying the groundwork for long-term economic stability. Looking back, Frances took great pride in the work she'd done to shape the New Deal. She understood that many of the policies they had implemented while groundbreaking were not without their challenges. There were many who had opposed the New Deal's social welfare programs, believing that they would erode individual freedoms or lead to socialism. Business leaders, conservative politicians, and even some within her own party had resisted these reforms. But Frances remained steadfast in her belief that the government had a moral obligation to protect its citizens, especially the working class and those who were suffering the most. The Social Security Act, which Frances had championed, was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the New Deal. It provided a safety net for the elderly, the disabled, and the unemployed, ensuring that no one would have to live in poverty in their later years or face financial ruin without assistance. The minimum wage laws and protections for child labour, also established under the New Deal, were similarly transformative, laying the foundation for fairer working conditions and better wages for generations of American workers. But Frances was not content to simply rest on the successes of the past. She recognised that the work of the New Deal was ongoing, and that more needed to be done to ensure that all Americans had access to the opportunities and protections they deserved. The civil rights movement, which was gaining momentum in the 1940s and 1950s, was an issue she continued to advocate for, even as the focus of the nation shifted toward other concerns. Frances saw the need for further reforms, particularly in addressing the racial inequalities that persisted in American society. She had long believed that economic justice could not be achieved without racial justice. She had fought for labor rights and social welfare programs that benefited the most vulnerable Americans, but she knew that true equality would only come when Black Americans were granted the same rights and opportunities as their white counterparts. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, Frances became an outspoken advocate for racial justice, pushing for policies that would combat segregation and ensure that Black Americans had equal access to education, housing, and employment. In her later years, Frances was also deeply concerned about the rise of conservatism in American politics. As the country emerged from the post-war era, many of the policies she had worked so hard to create were under attack. Business interests and conservative politicians, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, sought to roll back many of the labor protections and social safety nets established during the New Deal. Frances recognized that these efforts to undo the work of the New Deal were part of a larger political shift toward laissez-faire economics and a diminished role for the government in regulating the economy. Despite these challenges, Frances remained optimistic about the future of the labor movement and the country's commitment to social justice. She believed that the principles of the New Deal, the idea that the government should act as a protector of the people's well-being, were too deeply ingrained in American society to be easily undone. The New Deal had laid the foundation for a more just and equitable society, and Frances had no doubt that future generations would continue the work she had started. In the final years of her life, Frances Perkins had the opportunity to witness the enduring impact of the New Deal and the labor reforms she had championed. The Social Security system, the minimum wage laws, and the protections for child labor were firmly entrenched in American society, and they continued to provide a safety net for millions of Americans. While she had faced significant opposition during her career, she could take comfort in knowing that the policies she'd helped create had transformed the lives of countless workers and their families. Frances' legacy, however, went beyond the laws she helped pass or the policies she helped shape. She had opened the doors for future generations of women to serve in public office, demonstrating that women could lead, could make a difference, and could fight for social change. She had shown that government could be a force for good, an instrument of social justice and economic security. Frances Perkins had lived a life dedicated to improving the lives of others, and her work would continue to inspire generations to come. In the years following her time as Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins remained a steadfast presence in American social and labor politics. While she had stepped down from her cabinet position in 1945, her dedication to the causes she had spent a lifetime championing did not waver. Despite the challenges of post-war conservatism, and the growing political pressures to roll back the labour and social reforms of the New Deal, Frances remained committed to the vision of a more just and equitable society. Although she was no longer involved in the day-to-day workings of government, Frances continued to use her voice to advocate for workers and for the expansion of the safety nets that had been established during her tenure in the Roosevelt administration. She was a frequent speaker at labour conventions and social reform conferences, where she shared her insights on labour policy, economic justice, and the importance of government intervention in ensuring fair wages and working conditions. Frances had witnessed firsthand the tremendous changes that had taken place in the United States during the New Deal, and she knew that these changes needed to be protected. She also understood that the social programs she'd fought for, such as Social Security and unemployment insurance, were not immune to political opposition. As the decades passed, Frances became increasingly concerned about the growing political divide, which saw a rise in opposition to the New Deal program she'd helped establish. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the nation's political climate began to shift, with conservative movements gaining ground and pushing for policies that would limit the government's role in regulating the economy and providing social welfare. Many of the labour laws and worker protections that Frances had fought for were now under threat, as business interests and conservative politicians worked to reduce the scope of government intervention in the economy. Frances, however, refused to let her work be undone. She understood that the New Deal had changed the way Americans viewed their government's role in their lives, and she knew that the protections it provided for workers were crucial to ensuring a fair and just society. In her later years, she continued to advocate for the maintenance and expansion of labour rights, knowing that these reforms were the foundation for the progress that had been made in the United States. One of the most significant causes Frances continued to champion in her later years was the issue of racial equality. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, Frances recognized that racial injustice was a significant obstacle to the nation's progress. Although she had spent much of her career advocating for economic justice and labor reform, she also understood that true equality could not be achieved without addressing the deeply entrenched racial discrimination that still existed in America. Frances' commitment to racial equality was not just a matter of personal conviction. It was also a natural extension of the work she'd done for workers' rights. She had always believed that economic justice and racial justice were interconnected, and that no meaningful social reform could occur without addressing the systemic racism that pervaded American society. In her later years, Frances continued to support the civil rights movement, advocating for policies that would help eliminate segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. She was particularly concerned with the disparities in employment and labour conditions faced by Black Americans. Frances worked alongside civil rights leaders and activists to push for greater inclusion of Black Americans in the workforce and for stronger protections against workplace discrimination. She recognized that without the economic opportunity and protections that had been extended to other groups through the New Deal, Black Americans would continue to face barriers to upward mobility. Frances' contributions to racial justice were not always as widely recognized as her work in labor reform, but she remained steadfast in her commitment to a more inclusive society. She was a strong ally in the fight for equal rights, and she understood that her advocacy for workers' rights could not be fully realized without addressing the racial inequalities that persisted in American society. Even as she grew older, Frances' commitment to the causes she cared about did not diminish. In her later years, she remained an active and respected voice in the social and labor reform communities. Her work continued to influence policy decisions, and she was often called upon to provide expert testimony and advice on labor and social welfare issues. She also wrote extensively about her experiences and her vision for a just society, sharing her insights with future generations of activists and policymakers. Frances Perkins' later years were marked by reflection on the progress that had been made and the work that still lay ahead. She had achieved so much during her lifetime, but she knew that the fight for workers' rights economic justice and racial equality was ongoing. She remained deeply involved in advocating for policies that would continue to protect and uplift the most vulnerable members of society. In her final years, Frances found a sense of fulfillment in knowing that the programs she'd helped create were still making a difference in the lives of millions of Americans. Social security, unemployment insurance, and labor protections had become integral parts of the American social safety net, and the reforms she'd fought for had laid the foundation for a more just and equitable society. When she passed away in 1965, Frances Perkins left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire future generations of social reformers and policymakers. Her work in labor law, her commitment to social welfare, and her advocacy for civil rights had shaped the course of American history, and her influence would be felt for decades to come. Frances Perkins' life and career continue to influence not only the field of labor law, but also the broader trajectory of American social and economic policy. Her pioneering work laid the foundation for the labor protections, social welfare programs, and civil rights advancements that would shape the second half of the 20th century and beyond. As the first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet position, Frances broke barriers for women in government and demonstrated the vital role that women could play in shaping public policy. The policies that Frances helped design, such as Social Security, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the minimum wage laws, continue to impact millions of Americans. These programs have provided financial security to the elderly, supported workers during times of unemployment, and ensured that millions of American families can afford basic necessities. The social safety net that Frances helped create remains a cornerstone of American life. But Frances' influence extends beyond the program she helped create. Her belief in the power of government to act as a force for good has inspired generations of social reformers, policymakers, and activists. Her work demonstrated that the government, rather than being an obstacle to progress, could be a powerful tool for improving the lives of working people and those most vulnerable in society. Her leadership set a precedent for women in leadership positions. At a time when women were often excluded from the halls of power, Frances Perkins broke new ground. Her appointment as Secretary of Labor was not just a personal achievement. It was a signal to the world that women could succeed at the highest levels of government. Her career paved the way for future generations of women who would follow in her footsteps, serving in public office, fighting for social justice, and shaping the future of the country. Frances's legacy also lives on in the ongoing fight for racial equality. Her commitment to economic justice was always tied to her belief that racial justice was equally important. She understood that economic disparities were often intertwined with racial inequalities, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that Black Americans and other marginalized groups had access to the same opportunities as their white counterparts. Her work during the New Deal, as well as her advocacy for civil rights in the post-war years, laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. One of the most enduring aspects of Frances Perkins' legacy is her belief in the dignity of work. She understood that work was not just a means of earning a living, it was an essential part of human dignity. She believed that workers should be treated with respect, paid fairly for their labor, and protected from exploitation. The laws she championed, such as the establishment of the minimum wage, workplace safety regulations, and protections against child labor, were designed to ensure that workers were not just cogs in a machine but individuals with rights and protections. As the decades have passed since her death, Frances' work has remained relevant. While new challenges have arisen, the issues she fought for, the rights of workers, the need for social welfare programs, and the importance of government intervention in ensuring justice, remain at the heart of political discourse in the United States. Her legacy continues to inspire those who believe in a fairer, more just society, and her work remains a touchstone for policymakers who seek to build on the progress of the New Deal. Frances Perkins' influence can also be seen in the broader context of the American labor movement. The labor rights she helped secure in the 1930s laid the groundwork for future labor struggles and victories. Her work gave workers a voice in the political process and ensured that their rights were recognized as a central part of the nation's economic framework. The labor protections she helped establish continue to be a vital part of the American social contract, and they remain a key focus for labor leaders and activists. In addition to her direct impact on social and economic policy, Frances' personal story serves as an inspiration to individuals who seek to make a difference in their communities. Her life demonstrates that one person can indeed have a profound impact on the course of history, even in the face of immense challenges. Frances Perkins' unwavering dedication to social justice, her ability to navigate the complexities of political life, and her steadfast belief in the power of government to create positive change continue to serve as a model for those who strive to make the world a better place. Frances' story is also a reminder of the importance of perseverance and the power of quiet, determined leadership. Throughout her career, she faced countless obstacles, some personal, some political, but she never wavered in her commitment to her values. Her calm, reasoned approach to problem solving and her willingness to work with others, even in difficult circumstances, are qualities that continue to be valued in public life. Frances Perkins may have passed away in 1965, but her work and her influence are very much alive today. Her legacy continues to shape the lives of millions of Americans, particularly workers and those who rely on social safety nets. Her story is a testament to the power of public service and the profound impact that one person can have on the world. As time moves on, the importance of Frances Perkins' work continues to resonate in modern American society. Her legacy as a pioneering labor reformer, advocate for workers' rights, and first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet position endures in the policies she championed, the system she helped create, and the values she instilled in those who continue the fight for a more just and equitable society. Frances's central role in the New Deal laid the foundation for the modern American social safety net, one that continues to provide economic security for millions of people. The Social Security Act of 1935, which she played an instrumental role in crafting, remains one of the most important pieces of legislation in U.S. history. It established a system of old-age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid for the disabled, programs that millions of Americans still rely on today. The Social Security system is one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, and Frances Perkins' leadership was crucial in making it a reality. The Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938, another hallmark of Frances' tenure as Secretary of Labor, also remains a cornerstone of American labor law. The FLSA established the first federal minimum wage, limited the work week to 40 hours, and introduced protections against child labor. These provisions laid the groundwork for the protection of workers' rights, ensuring fair wages and safe working conditions for generations of Americans. The minimum wage laws and child labor protections that Frances helped create were essential in raising the standard of living for millions of workers, particularly in the most vulnerable industries. Frances's work was not only about creating laws and regulations, it was about shifting the national mindset toward a more compassionate, inclusive understanding of government's role in society. She believed that government intervention was essential to protect citizens from exploitation and ensure that no one was left behind in the pursuit of economic opportunity. Her advocacy for workers, women, and marginalized communities demonstrated the power of government to shape a more just society. Her vision of a government that acts in the best interest of the people has become a guiding principle for many social and economic policies that followed. In the decades since Frances' death, the social programs she helped establish have been a vital part of the American social fabric. Social security has become a lifeline for the elderly and disabled, while the protections introduced by the Fair Labor Standards Act have created a framework for fair labor practices across the country. These programs have helped reduce poverty, provided economic security, and empowered workers to fight for their rights. Yet, the relevance of Frances' work is not just confined to the system she helped build, it also extends to the broader principles she stood for. Her commitment to social justice, economic fairness, and equality continues to be a touchstone for advocates and policymakers who are working to address the challenges facing today's society. The fight for fair wages, workplace protections, and expanded social welfare programs is ongoing, and Francis's work remains a powerful example of what can be achieved when the government acts as a force for good. Frances Perkins' legacy also continues to inspire future generations of women in public service. As the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States, she broke barriers for women in politics, proving that women could serve at the highest levels of government. Her example has inspired countless women to follow in her footsteps, working in public service, law, and social reform. Today, women are serving in positions of power and influence in government, and many of them cite Frances Perkins as a trailblazer and role model. Her life also serves as a reminder of the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. Throughout her career, Frances faced resistance, both for her gender and for her progressive policies. But she never gave up on her vision for a more just society. Whether it was advocating for the rights of workers, fighting for the establishment of social security, or standing up to political opposition, Frances remained unwavering in her commitment to social change. She faced down obstacles with quiet determination, proving that one person could indeed change the course of history. Frances's work is a blueprint for those who seek to create a more equitable society. Her belief in the power of government to promote social justice is still relevant today, as we continue to grapple with issues like income inequality, access to healthcare, and labour rights. Frances Perkins' life reminds us that lasting change is possible, even in the face of great opposition, and that social justice is not just an ideal. It's a responsibility that requires action. In today's world, the values that Frances Perkins championed are more important than ever. The need for social safety nets, fair wages, and workplace protections is as urgent as it was during the Great Depression. The fight for racial and gender equality continues, and the lessons Frances taught us about the importance of economic justice remain relevant in an era of growing inequality. Frances Perkins' work has helped shape the nation's commitment to fairness and equality. Her legacy lives on in the laws she helped pass, the system she helped create, and the example she set for future generations. In a time of increasing political polarization, Frances' belief in the power of government to protect and uplift its citizens serves as a reminder of what can be achieved when we work together for the common good. As we reach the end of our journey through the life of Frances Perkins, it is clear that her legacy extends far beyond the time she spent in office. Her contributions to American society remain deeply woven into the fabric of the nation's labor laws, social safety nets, and commitment to fairness and justice. Through her vision, determination, and tireless advocacy for workers, Frances helped to shape a future where economic security and human dignity were seen as rights, not privileges. Her legacy endures in the programs she helped create, the system she shaped, and the lasting impact she had on generations of Americans. Frances Perkins lived a life dedicated to the principle that government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, particularly the most vulnerable. She was not just a policymaker, but a moral force, ensuring that the voices of working-class Americans were heard and that their needs were addressed. Her work laid the foundation for programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and workplace protections, which continue to serve as essential pillars of American society today. These programs have lifted millions out of poverty, provided financial security to the elderly and disabled, and ensured that workers are treated with dignity and respect. As the first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet position, Frances also broke barriers for women in politics, demonstrating that gender should never be an obstacle to leadership. She proved that women could be just as effective as men in positions of power, and she became a trailblazer for future generations of women who would follow in her footsteps. Her legacy as a pioneering woman in government continues to inspire women around the world to pursue careers in public service and work towards social change. Frances's work in labour reform, social justice and civil rights was ahead of its time and her influence can still be felt today. As new challenges arise, from the fight for a higher minimum wage to the ongoing struggles for racial and gender equality, Frances Perkins' example serves as a guide for those who seek to make the world a more just and equitable place. Her dedication to fighting for the most vulnerable members of society, her belief in the power of government to create positive change, and her unwavering commitment to social justice remain as relevant now as they were during the New Deal. In many ways, the world Frances Perkins worked to build is still a work in progress. Her efforts to ensure fair wages, workplace protections, and social welfare programs have made the country more just, but there is still much work to be done. The principles she fought for, economic justice, racial equality, and workers' rights, continue to be at the forefront of social and political movements today. Her legacy continues to inspire those who advocate for a fairer, more inclusive society. In remembering Frances Perkins, we are reminded that change does not come easily, but it is possible through tireless work, dedication, and a commitment to what is right. Frances demonstrated that one person can make a difference, and that with the right vision and determination, lasting change is achievable. She proved that it is possible to break through the barriers of inequality, discrimination, and injustice, and to build a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. As we reflect on Frances' life and her contributions to American society, we are reminded of the power of public service and the importance of fighting for what is just. Frances Perkins was not just a woman who held a cabinet position. She was a force for good, a visionary who transformed the lives of millions, and a pioneer who helped to shape the future of the country. Her legacy is a testament to the enduring importance of social reform, workers' rights, and the belief that government can be a force for positive change. Frances Perkins' story is one of perseverance, vision, and leadership. Her life and work stands as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is never over, and that every effort, no matter how difficult or opposed, can have a lasting impact. Her example continues to inspire those who follow in her footsteps, and her contributions will never be forgotten.